If you don't learn something new about Barbara Johns today, I will be surprised, because I guarantee you every time I hear another panel or talks or whatever, you learn something new and different. And we're really excited to have Dr. Amy Tillerson Brown, Professor of History and Barbara Johns Scholar from Mary Baldwin with us, grew up in Prince Edward County. Margaret Eads, former reporter, editor for numerous papers, retired journalist, and wrote this book about Oliver Hill, which Barbara Johns is tied into. And thankful and thank our Senator McClellan, who is also on the museum board, and also steeped in Barbara Johns. In fact, we have one last thing about that I'll say. A couple years ago, we had our Democratic Steering Committee meeting. Remember, Margot and Steve? I'm not sure if you were there. At the Moe Museum. And honestly, it was really spiritual almost to have it there. And they were so welcoming and they accommodating for us. To be able to do that, I certainly hope that we can go back and do that at another time as well. One last housekeeping thing, because we couldn't have all these great events happen without help from a whole bunch of people. And we have some really great sponsors today. Virginia AFL-CIO endorsed Kraus Mays. Every zip code counts now. You ask, who is that? Actually, that's Tom President. Recall and support the party and support this event. He's got a little race going over there in Maryland, so he's a little busy today, but he's running for governor over there for next year. Senator Mark Warner, Arlington Zone, Senator Barbara Favola, Columbia Cares. Anybody here from Columbia Care yet? Alrighty. Delegate Patrick Cope, whose district is here and helped us secure this facility. Craig Hines, another great Democratic community member, as well as Ms. Donna Russell and Mr. Peter Kent. Anyway, I'll just talk now and turn it over to Senator McClellan.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today as we honor the life and legacy of someone who, who is a hero. And I think a lot of people forget that every major movement in social justice, young people and children, and technically Barbara was a child, have led the way. And even today, if you think back as we commemorated the anniversary of the United Bride Rally, that rally was around a movement led by another, at the time, high school student. So today, we want to celebrate the importance of a young woman who not only changed her community, but changed the country. And we want to make sure that we not only give her her due, but that we recognize her as the courageous woman that she was, because we owe her so much. And you've all heard the story. We'll hear a little bit more about the story. But I think, while everyone understands and has heard the name Brown versus Board of Education, unfortunately, not everyone around the country understands and traditional negative assumptions associated with their race and gender network to build their communities. We also have another author in our midst, Margaret Eves, who, as you heard, is a political and state government reporter, editorial writer, and weekly columnist for the Virginia Pilot newspaper in Norfolk for many years. She also has several books published, including her most recent, and there are a few copies in the back, We Face the Dawn, Oliver Hill, Spotswood Robinson, and the legal team that dismantled Jim Crow, which discusses the South's most significant grassroots legal challenge from Jim Crow separatism during the 1940s and the 1950s. Both of them have many awards and recognition, but they are here today to talk about Barbara Johns, the Logan strike, and the legacy as a result, and how that still is important and resonates with what's going on today. So let me just start with my first question, and we will start with Dr. Tillerson Brown. One of the more unique parts of Barbara's story is the fact that she was just 16 years old when she organized the student strike. How did her family, community upbringing, and influence, her family, community, and upbringing influence her and guide her activism?
Sure. Thank you all for having this program, and thank you for inviting me to share some of my knowledge of Barbara Johns. One thing about Barbara, how did her community and upbringing, well, we have much of her family that's here with us today. She grew up in a small, she was born in New York City, but she grew up primarily in a small part of Prince Edward County, Darlington Heights, Virginia. And there with her 4 siblings, one sister is here, and I think a brother or 2 are here. After going back and forth for a bit between DC and New York and back to the Darlington Heights community, she grew up and attended the Triumph Baptist Church there. And when she was young and attended the church, as it would be in those rural districts, that we went to church typically, once a month there for various reasons, maybe transportation. But I think church was still a central part of that larger Darlington Heights community. And Triumph Baptist Church was her church. And so I'm sure then that the influence of the church and the church community was there with not only Barbara, but also her siblings, her maternal grandmother, who she spent quite a bit of time with growing up. But also, I think that Barbara Johns' activism that showed up in 1951 was part of a larger trajectory of activism that existed in rural Prince Edward County even before 1951. Right? So she had the influences of church women, club women, group women who were all working to build community, whether she sat in a class with them specifically or not. She may or may not have come in contact with the likes of folks like Pearl Madden. You all know Pearl Madden from Mercy Seat at AME Church. Connie Rollins was her daughter, played the piano. Laverne Kerbal, who just before the student strike had negotiated to start a small public library in Prince Edward County because blacks weren't allowed to borrow books from the white library that existed there. So Barbara knew these women. She might have come in contact with them at places like the Sunday School Union. It's not that people would often move from somewhere like Darlington Heights to Fargo once a month and go to church, but sometimes that union would travel around those rural districts. And there everyone would show up kind of taking turns district by district. So she's likely to have seen some of those powerhouses even outside of the Moton School, where she definitely saw on a regular basis lots of activist type women with great ideas that nurtured hers, one major one being the student protest of 1951. She heard conversations going on in her house amongst her parents and her very activist uncle, the Reverend Vernon Johns, who was at Lynchburg Seminary and backwards and forwards between there and wherever else he was preaching. But he had a store in Darlington Heights that her father took over when he was back and forth. So assuredly, she heard many of those conversations and came to hate segregation as vehemently as her uncle did. I think that many of those things fostered within her this burning desire to speak out for what she knew was right, despite what the consequences may have been. And what she knew was that she was going to have the support of her family at home. And I think that that nurturing environment is what gave her the strength to even do what she did on that, have the bravery to do what she did on that April 23rd, March 1951, after the months of planning with her and other student leaders. But I think it's important to note that her activism comes on the trajectory of a larger pattern of activism that lots of people, especially Black women, unnamed still, had to work with and make the world better as a result of, as Barbara Johnson did.
And Margaret, you want to add to that?
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Susan. This is the sixth of these, but I think it's the first since she was chosen to represent Virginia in the National Statuary Hall. Especially honored and delighted to be part of it because of that. Everybody in Virginia, and really now, but for many years, everybody who knew politics in Virginia knew about Barbara Johns. But I got to know more about her in working on the book about Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson, and then also being able to write a piece about her for Encyclopedia of Virginia, which is now online. And the two major sources for that were her sister, who was such a great help in all of that, and then some of her own writing. So I brought with me her diary, if you want to call it that, and in the question of how she was impacted by her family or community of upbringing, I thought I'd just read you a couple of things that she wrote herself to describe that. First, she had a considerable amount of responsibility at a very young age, and I think that probably gave her some confidence. Her mother went back and forth to Washington to work a great deal, so she had to help take care of the younger children. And here's what she said about that. She said, "I had a great deal of responsibility thrust on my shoulders, both outside in the fields and inside the house. One seldom got a chance to sit down and rest before the familiar cry of 'Barbary,' as she and her grandmother called her. I'd then rush to feed the chicken, pick up chips from the wood stove, run to the spring for a bucket of cool fresh water, gather the eggs, or do some other household chore. So a lot of responsibility. She also had this very supportive and very esteemed family, particularly through her uncle, Vernon Johns, who was a renowned minister at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. He preceded Martin Luther King Jr. there. And here's what she said about his influence. She said, "The fireplace in the living room was flanked by two ceiling-to-floor bookshelves full of books left by my uncle who had moved to Montgomery. We spent many nights reading by the warmth of the fire. Here I read The Postman Always Rings Twice, H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, and many others. In between his trips from Montgomery to Virginia, my uncle would make sure we spent some of our time devouring the books he kept in the big house, particularly the encyclopedia. We were required to start with Volume A and work up to Volume Z. Needless to say, I did not relish this type of imposed and restricted reading, so I managed to circumvent around this by inserting a few Archie and Veronica comic books or some other material between the pages. Her grandmother, also, as you mentioned, Sally Johns, Vernon's mother, was a strong influence, and she was a very opinionated, outspoken woman. Barbara said about her, she argued good-naturedly, but nevertheless she argued about everything from when the war would end, who was likely to win, and how much sugar a sane person should put in a cup of coffee. And then, lastly, I think she had a very independent, thoughtful nature, and that was probably key also in what she did. And she said about that, sometimes to avoid all the ruckus, I would roam through the woods, wrapping myself in its quiet embrace, listening only to the sound of the birds, the scattering of squirrels, rabbits, and other small creatures underfoot, occasionally a startled deer deer would be hurried away, or a brace of quail would take flight, or some other small creature would scurry away. But mostly it was quiet and peaceful, and I sought the woods for solitude and to read in peace.
It's always exciting to hear Barbara's own words. And again, I think it's important to not just talk about the past, but to tie the past to the present. And Barbara is one in a long line of young people who have made a difference in their community, and who are still doing that today. So this time I'll start with Margaret. What do you think that young people who are getting involved in activism and politics today can learn from Barbara? And then I'll throw in there a second piece of the question is, who are some of the activists that remind you of Barbara today?
Well, Emma Gonzalez, I guess we know from Parkland, who stood for 6.5 minutes in silence to commemorate her fellow students who were slain. Greta Thunberg sailed across the Atlantic, and Zahara Bryant, who you mentioned earlier, who was a student in Charlottesville, who really got the petition going for taking down the statue there of Robert E. Lee, all independent young people. So I think things that you might learn from her as a young person. One is that she really was meticulous in her planning. She really took time with it. She started out with a very small group of people she knew she could trust, who were respected student leaders, and then she gradually built on that. She also really had the courage of her convictions, and that was what so impressed Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson when they came to town soon after the strike began, really thinking that they did not want to take this case because they did not think rural Virginia was the place to be launching an attack on segregated schools. But they were so impressed by Barbara and her fellow students and their commitment. So she had the courage of her convictions. And then third, and I'm not sure if this is critical, but I think it's interesting, they really enlisted the help of adults only when it became necessary. They did this on their own, and then when they needed to take it to a higher level in the courts, then they turned to adult supervision. And in fact, I think they seemed to recognize that there was a moral authority that came with youth. And because of that, they tried to protect the older people in their school who they knew, the principal, some of the teachers, they knew would be seriously affected by what they were doing.
Sure. Yeah, well, thank you for that answer. But yes, I think of the leaders today, as Bryant was one that I think we had talked about before that really comes to mind. In fact, most of the people that you named came to my mind. There was one other though, Chelsea, the two youth leaders who came together in Columbia, and they started this march for voting rights out of New York. So those would be two others when we're thinking about youth activists, I guess, today that are following the lead of women like Barbara Johns, and I think that would be the only one that I can come up with right now to add to the list that has already been shared. But what I think they have learned from Barbara Johns, whether they know it or not, is the importance of galvanizing the community. This was not something that Barbara Johns came up with on her own and said, hey, let me go do this protest by myself. What she understood was that the change that came as a result would not only be impactful for her and her cadre of students that she was there with, but also generations to come behind. And I agree with you that that's why she so earnestly required then the core group that she spoke with first to bring people that they also trusted into the conversation to get everyone on the same page. It's almost as if she knew even then that the only way that this would work is that if everyone got on the same page. And while she was the one out in front, she wasn't out kind of by herself. She kind of had the throngs of that student leadership group behind her. And I think that's what gave it the momentum to push through and convince those very able lawyers that were on their way to Pulaski, weren't they? Before stopping in rural Prince Edward County to take a chance on Prince think made her the likely candidate to be such the able spokesperson that she was. Now, I've forgotten the second half of the question.
So you answered both.
Oh, you're good.
I will add just on the sort of what young people today can learn. I think it's important to understand that you can't view your activism in a vacuum. That what you do is part of a larger mosaic of action, and that there will be a reaction. And I think it's important to, even if you have a narrow view in mind, that when you see how it connects to the big picture, you have to be willing to take your role in that. And I think it's important here, the strike was to get a better school. When the students started the strike, they were not aiming to end segregation. They just wanted a better school. But what they didn't realize was there was a larger plan under the NAACP and Charles Hamilton, Houston, and Cadre Waters, included Oliver Hill, Spotswood Robinson, and Thurgood Marshall, to methodically take down segregation. And they were looking for a place to do it. And they stopped in Prince Edward County, mainly because they just got harassed. Like, let's just go leave this one, leave us alone while we plan. And they saw how their movements were connected, and it led to an even bigger movement. So sometimes it's even if you have a singular goal in mind, recognize how it fits into the larger mosaic and be flexible. Was very important. But again, I alluded to sometimes there's a backlash. And the Ku Klux Klan harassed Barbara and her family because of her involvement in the strike and the civil rights movement. And so this time I'll start with Amy. What does that say about our society and that racial justice advocates, and again, you see this throughout history, when there is action, there is often violence, reaction. And what can people do to target that, counter that targeted reaction?
What that says about our society when we're talking to a historian, so I'm going to try to keep it very, very brief, is that racial justice is going to have to be something that we have to just get ready to fight for almost every day. It does not come by the passage of laws. Laws don't necessarily change people's mind. In fact, I can't point to a place where I see that someone passing a law has changed people's mind. I don't know. I know you all didn't do this on the way up here on 95. We know what the speed limit is, right? But what stops us from speeding other than waves when they tell us that a police officer is close by? It's knowing that if you get stopped, there's going to be a consequence. So without any accountability, right, we can't really expect for racial equity to come to fruition in the ways that our beautiful Constitution promises for citizens of each United States of America. So what do we know? We know that the fight is going to be long and hard. We know that someone benefits from what we see clearly as this injustice. And those that benefit from the injustice are equally as determined to keep their position as those who know the injustice exists are into fighting against it. So whenever you get involved in this, it's going to be a fight. And so for those activists who think, well, I'm going to go to this protest and I'm going to hold a sign, and that's going to be the extent of my wonderful activism, then that's the extent of your wonderful activism, but the struggle, the marathon, continues. Every step that we take, I think we can expect to be able to hand the baton to a generation after, because what history teaches me is that with every 3 steps forward, often the backlash comes and therefore back. Now we can go all the way and talk about Reconstruction and the Nadir, but hopefully with that knowledge, there's always hope. I'm a prisoner of hope, as I'm sure many of you in this room are. With that hope, we're just going to hope to push through. We know more today than we did 200 years ago. We know more today than we did in 1951. And some of those blind spots that Barbara and her family had, now we can kind of come to anticipate and try to prepare in ways to get ready for that. Knowing all the while, however, that the struggle is there and the marathon must continue.
the question of what does it say about our society that extremists are still targeting people? I think it says that insecure people still exist and that they are susceptible to hate messages and that there are people who are very willing to exploit that insecurity through pushing hate and pushing violence. How do we defeat it? It's a long process. I don't know other than to call it out and to counter disinformation with facts and truth wherever that can be done. That may persuade some, that we can see will not persuade all.
The only thing I would add about what we can do about it is we be vigilant and continue to tell the stories of our history. Because and you're absolutely right, we cannot, it is not laws alone that change hearts. We need the laws. But whether you're a legislator, whether you are a person in the community, your views are shaped by your life experience and what you know. And as the stories of the civil rights movement, whether it's the 1950s and 60s, whether it's in response to Reconstruction in the early 1900s, as the participants in the history begin to die off. And those stories are only passed down in some communities and not all. We begin to lose not only the stories, but the ramifications of the stories. And that is why it is important those stories are told publicly, through public history, through events like this, through commemorations, through statues that reflect a complete history, and yes, in our schools. And to pick up on a thread that Amy began to weave, and I want to make sure it sticks with us every time in our history that African Americans in particular and marginalized communities in general gain social, political, and economic power. There has been a backlash that has included 3 prongs: violence, voter suppression, and laws to roll back progress, and propaganda designed to break up coalitions that are working towards progress. Whether that lie is the lie of white supremacy or the lie of stolen election, whether that violence is the KKK, Bull Connor and his dogs and fire hoses, or what we saw on January 6th. And it is critically important that we recognize that history, so we recognize that pattern. And we remember all of us, every generation has a responsibility to keep that progress. Now, again, past, present, are all interconnected. Barbara was fighting, whether she intended to originally or not, Barbara was fighting school segregation. Unfortunately, today our schools are just as segregated as they were in Barbara's day. So this is your opportunity. I think it's Barbara's turn first. Is what do our political leaders need to know to do to begin to really finally end school segregation and improve the quality of our schools?
Would someone else like to start? This is we are so much better at identifying this problem than we are at doing anything to fix it. In 1948, Spotswood Robinson went around Virginia identifying disparities in black and white schools. And then they went to court and tried to fix those. And what they saw clearly was that efforts to make black and white education equal on a segregated basis did not work. And that is as true today as it was then. So what has happened since then? In 1988, integration really peaked in our public schools, and we've been dialing back ever since. We ended busing. We had decisions like the 2007 decision impacting Louisville and Seattle, which said basically that even voluntary efforts at integration based on race could not stand. We've also had since then such a dramatic change in our school population. In Barbara's day, it was a question of black and white. Today, in 2016, 48% white, 26% Latino, 15% black, about 5 to 6% Asian. So we're dealing with a very different population. And what is happening, we're seeing, is that the number of intensely segregated non-white schools has been dramatically growing over the last decade. And so we find ourselves in a situation where many schools that focus particularly on black and Latino students by class and by race are poor schools, do not have the facilities, do not have the amount of money being spent. And then we have middle class schools that seem to cater particularly to whites and Asians. So how do we fix that? Particularly because the courts are no longer billing the benefit that they were in Barbara's day. It's really such a complex web of housing and school assignments and school funding policies. You know, you can look at so many things, like in Virginia, our school lines are drawn by county and city. And so immediately you're getting sort of pockets of poverty, pockets of wealth, and those lines can't be crossed. Our housing situation needs to be changed. There needs to be more affordable housing in communities. Just the restrictive covenants that we have in housing, that works against it. We need to find ways to encourage school districts to cross racial and economic lines. And it's very difficult to do today because you cannot have the benefit of the courts that were there in Barbara's day.
It's really a big question, isn't it? I mean, how do you deal with this de facto segregation that we know exists in public schools, especially even just today? And I think you brought up a great point. The issue is structural. We've been hearing this since 2020, right after George Floyd. The issue is systemic. I mean, it gets to the very core of why we operate the way we operate just as individual human beings, but you can't fix one without fixing the other. The schools are segregated because the housing districts are segregated. The housing districts are segregated because of the jobs that people can get and the income that they're bringing home to be able to afford what districts that they are living in. All right, and so one quick and easy answer, well, one quick, I don't know how easy, the response could be, well, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. When you go to these schools, but listen, I understand that to be true, but I'm not saying the onus is then on the poor people who are being marginalized to have to come up and say, guess what? You're paying us each student's annual percentage per student is much lower than the whites over in this district there. We see this, but the reality is the school administrators see it also. But there is no reason for them to change that because they don't have to be accountable. Now I may be going off on a tangent, but I'm going to come back. Especially after COVID, right? After the COVID crisis and all of the ARP funds that are coming, you know, in this great Commonwealth, we have school districts that are receiving millions of dollars. We know also from research that the Virginia Department of Education put out is that black and brown students have been most marginalized as a result of COVID when we're looking at their scores, their mental health. But we have the school districts where there's nothing in place to check to see if that disparity is being dealt with, right, with the increased funding that's coming as a result of those funds. So you have individual activists who have been going around saying, listen, implicit bias exists in schools. There are scholars who have done the work. Monique Morris with Push Out. Bettina Lovell, we want to do more than just survive. You know, we want to thrive. That bias is leading to the opportunity gaps that plague so many of our school districts and just fuel that school to prison pipeline. We know that exists. But usually the response is well, we don't have the money to get the training. Now here's an opportunity that we do possibly have the money to get the training and to respond to the disparity as it exists, but no one's pushing that. So what could policymakers do? That might be something that they could do right now. You get what I'm saying? It's because if you don't, then what you have are these students who have been most marginalized coming back to these institutes or institutions that racially traumatize them on a day-to-day basis. And there are no checks and balances being put in place. And there are no districts truly that have to be held accountable for that. I'm not really sure that there's a law that says this is what discrimination looks like in the educational setting, and these are the consequences that you will get after you get through all of the red tape, which gets us back to that first question prior to this. Why is it that violence still exists? I'm not sure those with all the power wanted to leave. Because if they did, it would. There's a benefit for it to being this way. I don't know that I want to go all the way into those meetings. So I'm just hand the microphone.
Let me read together a couple of things I heard again. I'm going to use the word intersectionality.
Oh, yeah.
Unfortunately, too often, government looks at issues in silos. We have Department of Education, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Transportation, Commerce and Labor, and they're all connected. You read together. You can't address, the effects of redlining in mortgages and banking and racial covenants didn't go away with the magic wand, and those things will be gone. So we've got to intentionally look at those issues intersectionally to address the impact of Jim Crow across all issues. So we have made, I would say, generational progress in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the rise, really unprecedented, almost overnight momentum in the civil rights movement. And now more people are fighting for social justice and racial justice. But the movement looks a little different. So, Amy, starting with you, what can the activists of today learn from the movement of the 1950s?
Thinking about Barbara John's activism in particular, Barbara John was upset about the inadequate facilities that she saw, that she endured on a day-to-day basis. She saw and she knew in her heart that disparity was not right. And she made up her mind to, as her teacher on this report challenged her to do something about it. And that's what she did from that position of how is my life being hurt by this discrimination. And she decided, I'm going to make a change. But what she knew was that she wasn't going to make that change by herself. She had already been well learned, right? She read, her grandmother, I think, said that she read whatever she could get her hands on. She was very bright. She was aware of what was going on nationally and within her own community. She saw that something was wrong and she got with groups of people that shared that general belief. And they planned. So one thing that youth activists, I think, can take from Barbara John in particular is the importance of creating a plan. Now, listen, I don't disagree with Martin King when he said riots are the voices of the unheard. We know that everyone doesn't plan in the same way. But when planning successful movements like this, I think that there needs to be, what are our goals? What are our objectives? How do we flesh those out to get to a point where we can actually start making policy change, if policy change is your objective? And if you're just angry, then hey, I understand that also. And there's a place for that. But I think something that the young activists today can take from Barbara John is to know what's going on around you and decide what's most important for you to fight for right now. And as Senator McClellan said, have the flexibility to change. Once you're bringing people in, if it's necessary for your larger objective, then have the flexibility and the ability to massage some of those borders, I guess, in your objectives.
similar answer. I think first, don't wait for someone else to start. Like as Davenport said, why don't you do something about it? So the thing is to recognize and then make a plan and begin doing something. One of the things I realized in researching this book was, in civil rights, there are the Thurgood Marshalls and the Martin Luther Kings and the Rosa Parks, and beneath them was a layer of people like Oliver Hill and Foster Robinson. But beneath them was hundreds, thousands of people who did little things. Some of them never knew that it made any difference. But really, when there is that collective push for something, change can happen. And that is the story of the civil rights movement there.
And then the last thing I'll add is, and I wrote so many notes on it, but it's just I'm not going to be a mom. The movement was multifaceted. It was protests. It was boycotts. It was lawsuits. It was speeches. It was demonstrations meant to move the masses. Martin Luther King chose to have students and children to participate because he knew, and he picked Birmingham on purpose. He picked Danville on purpose because he knew the overreaction he would get would wake up modern women and begin to move their hearts. So I think part of what we need to understand in any movement is it's multifaceted, and you gotta have a commitment. It is not you do the protest and then you go home. It is the sustained dedication until change happens, which is not easy and not for the faint of heart. So, what would Barbara Johns think of the current push for racial justice and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement? And we've talked about this a little bit, but how is today's movement similar or different from her era?
Well, I think she'd be all for it. It's very different. I'm not sure that she would even recognize what's happening now. She was operating at a point when Black people in the South had absolutely no power. There were no elected officials. People were being lynched. There were bombings. She would not recognize the General Assembly of today. Her weapons were moral authority and the courts. And today, of course, as I said earlier, the courts are less sympathetic. But at the same time, Black people have a much stronger base of power, as we're seeing in the General Assembly right now, and what has happened in the last couple of years there. She said when she realized that this was going to be a push for desegregation, we felt like we were reaching for the stars. Well, today, she would not see this as some impossible dream. I think she would see it as what is just and what is right, and it would be more a demand than a plea. So it's a different world that we're operating.
Thank you. What major difference is social media? Yeah, what major difference is social media, where she's collecting the small group of friends and meeting behind bleachers and in the small discrete spots on Moten's campus. Today, we can galvanize communities with a hashtag, right? We can bring them all together with a hashtag. So to a degree, in a way, some may be able to see the mechanisms for activism as making it more susceptible for the possibilities of change, right? Where it's different now than ever. I also think she would be proud. I think she would be very, very proud. I also think that Barbara Johns recognized power within the Black community. While they were being ostracized, we know what it was like in 1940s, 1951. We know what she dealt with, even having to go to Montgomery because of the threat of violence. We know that overarching fear of white retaliation through violence existed. Some might argue it still exists today, right? That would be definitely a similarity that exists today and was there. But I think that Barbara Johns saw and knew within her own community she did have power. Because if she didn't recognize that power, she wouldn't have been as brave as she was but to stand up in that auditorium with 400 plus students and lead them out of it. She knew the voice of her Uncle Vernon. She knew the voice of her father, who ran that store and had to deal with the interactions of whites calling him by his first name or uncle, and him having the restraint and power to come home and take care of his family. So I do totally understand the point that blacks were often devoid of much political power then. I think she was I think that Barbara would have examined her community without that white filter for self. And I think that's what gave her the support and the esteem to go forth and do what she did. And I think that's what she would challenge blacks today to do. Black activists, people of color that are speaking out on behalf of marginalized communities. Almost, while we know the numbers are what they are, don't believe the hype that you don't have a voice, that you can't still try to make change. And that's not to say that she would say there is no systemic and structural racism. I think she would know that too. But I think that as brave as she was on that April day in 51 to stand up and say, we've got to make a change, she would encourage communities of youth to realize the power that they had in their one voice and make change to the best of their abilities.
And so what does it mean to honor the legacy of Barbara Johnson in 2021? Amen, sir.
Sure. I think that, well, I'm definitely honored. Being a daughter of Prince Edward County, I graduated from Prince Edward County High School. My mother was one of what the historians have called a lost generation that I challenge in my work. I don't necessarily think they were lost. What it shows is the primacy of white supremacy and how powerful it was under the reign of massive resistance. But they worked and they built community in spite of. So I'm honored then to speak on a panel about what I see as a foremother of the community that I have grown up in. And I almost see it as a challenge that not only I have, but I have to teach my students and my children and my nieces and my nephews that, look, this is the tradition of activism that has preceded us. Can you imagine what these folk had to deal with? Yes, it's better, but we still have trials and tribulations to overcome in 2021. But look what they did back then. It invigorates me. It encourages me. It fortifies me to even go another day. So when I'm teaching in a U.S. history class where there is no mention of a Barbara Johns, Prince Edward, and very slight mention of Brown v. Board of Education, and say, wait a minute, but I know this story that they didn't include. And if you want to talk about why they didn't include it, then that will lead us to a larger discussion of systemic and structural racism, but I'm not sure you want that right now. But I think that those stories and those experiences they've definitely shaped my worldview. And what I hope is that in recounting these stories and telling these stories, holding them dear, telling these truths, that we can continue to encourage generations of those who come after us and make them realize that this is a larger history, this is a longer trajectory, and the freedom struggle isn't over.
Honoring her legacy, I think, means for each of us, in whatever sphere of influence we have, to speak out against injustice when we see it. Not ask why me, but to ask why not me. I'm the one who needs to take action. And really, in her method, to work diligently, systematically, and courageously for change.
I would finish with, we honor her legacy by picking up the baton and running with it, and making sure the next generation comes with us, and we keep fighting the fight until we don't need to fight, for as long as that takes. So now we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience before we turn it over to Barbara Stanley to share their reflections. So any questions? I guess we only have one microphone, so I will walk around and do a little bit of exercise. The car
Hi. So my experience has been come to this country as a teenager in 64, and suddenly I was in Tennessee on a project at the Oak Ridge National Labs. And that's when I realized how rampant the discrimination was. I mean, they looked at me and they said that you're okay because my hair is not kinky. But, you know, I couldn't go to the restroom or the gas station. I couldn't do, you know, it was real. I think my perspective from all that and, you know, marching with Stokely Carmichael and, you know, the other side, the more harder protests, you know, about the injustice, that we should get away from the word black. Trump has given us a huge, huge kind of thing. We are all colored now. And we got to embrace our, you know, Latin brothers and also sort of, you know, look after them. We must assimilate it in larger part. They are a growing kind of thing. And, you know, it is injustice for us all. You know, they also suffer that. And I think by embracing it, we have even greater power. You know, and I think we should sort of, you know, do that. That's just
Yeah. Hi, this was a fantastic panel. All of you very, very fantastic. I'm not from here. I've only lived in Virginia 2 years, but I did work in the school system in Miami-Dade County for 40 years. They have actually, I was a social worker, a special ed teacher. They actually have equal funding there as far as that goes through whatever part of the county you live in. The teachers are paid the same. Everything's the same. You said something so important. So much of why bad things happen are propaganda. There was really nothing wrong with the schools. Yes, we had to make improvement. Yes, we had to bring up money overall for everybody. However, we had a governor come in related to a former president, and that was, I will say, it was Jeb Bush. And they have put it out there that the schools were bad. They were bad. And they started the charter school movement because the schools were bad. That was not true, but that made, again, another white flight, I will say that. What do you feel has been the role of, I would ask all three of you, the role of charter schools? And maybe in Virginia it's different, but what I saw happen in Florida was really circumvent integration as well as this equal funding that we had for throughout our county. Propaganda is so much of what happens.
I think here in Virginia, and again, this is why it's important that people's political views are shaped by their life experiences. The charter school movement never took off in Virginia the way it did in some other southern cities because we had a Henry Marsh, who was one of Oliver Hill's law partners. And we had, you know, a Louise Lucas, you know, people in power who remembered that when we had massive resistance in Virginia, here it was academies and state funding for black students to go out of state to go to school, or for white students to go to these private academies. And they being Henry Marsh and Louise Lucas and the members of the legislative Black Caucus, saw how charter schools was the modern version of that. And so they never really took off here in Virginia, despite repeated efforts to really get them going, because of the fact that we had a legislation that more fully reflected the experiences of other communities.
Well, thank you.
Okay, maybe you.
Clearly Barbara Johns is a great hero. I'm wondering whether there was a Claudette Colvin type figure, as there was in Miami, and Barbara Johns was more the Rosa Parks.
Wait.
I definitely get the analogy, like Colvin, but March 55 and then December we have Rosa Parks, and there were a few in between. A student leading a protest in Prince Edward prior to Barbara in 51. A student doesn't come to mind. Parents, I know that parents had been petitioning the school board since the early 40s, late 30s. Well, I was 39 when that school was built, definitely the 40s, for equitable facilities, including bus transportation. But I am not aware in my research of any students that staged a protest for against inadequate facilities in the city.
intersectionality, housing, wages, education, as well as activism and our political legislation, I couldn't help but think about Representative Cori Bush on the steps of the Capitol before the eviction moratorium. And that ability, I stood by her on the steps of the Capitol, and that combination of activism, but understanding that housing really affects so many of us. As someone who was born and raised in Arlington, my parents were homeless when I was first born. We went through a lot of housing insecurity. I'm curious in this fight for racial justice, what are other examples of intersectionality that we can look to, either between activism and the political world, or things like education and housing, especially given we're living in a post-pandemic world, and that really has affected so many of our families here.
That's a great question. I'm a good moderator.
Well, I'm thinking of Richmond and maybe an example of intersectionality that didn't fully work, where an attempt in our school system, and the school system is very heavily minority, but there was a recent attempt to dilute that somewhat by changing boundaries, which relates to housing, and redrawing those, and unfortunately it didn't take. But it was an example of an effort to be aware of the fact that housing is so related to the school system, and the need to break down these barriers.
Yeah, it's a recognition, again, that every issue affects everything else. So if you look at the city of Richmond, you can't fully explain segregation if you don't, how segregation created not just pockets of Black communities and white communities, but poor communities that were also Black. Because when you have a highway decisions about where to put highways, cutting Black communities in half, and cutting them off from the business center, and you have public transportation decisions, where you put bus routes, and where you put stops that are not going to connect these communities that are now physically cut off. All of that's connected. When you think about decisions about where you put power plants and how those are in those poor Black communities, you've got to recognize that every single issue affects another one. So then when the General Assembly passes laws that not only recognize the concept of environmental justice, but says every decision we make is going to be looked at through the lens of equity, whether it's an environmental decision or an education decision or a housing decision. You've got to begin to connect them. Where you take an issue, you take the children's cabinet that says we're going to bring all of the stakeholders together to make decisions that affect children, and make them talk to each other. You've got to break down the silos among decision makers so they understand how their decisions affect other people. If you don't do that, you're never going to break down systemic racism.
This is for Dr. Tillerson Brown. I just want to make sure I understand. When you say your mother was part of the lost generation, was she was part of this when the school shut down, and did she stay at home, or was she, I know some folks, the Quakers took them in, others like relatives, and I'd just be interested in her story. Because, the other part about this is, it wasn't one day they went out and marched, and, 3 days later, the deal was done. This was a year long for all these younger folks in here. This was years and years and years and going, so, yeah.
Right, after Barbara John's strike that led to the Davis case in 1952-53, Prince Edward got some get right and built the larger high school, Moulton High School, that was really superior to the Farmville High School that had existed previously. Well, we still had in that county lawsuits being pushed forward they moved through Virginia. After the passage of the Brown decision in 1954, they had started bringing groups together, figuring out how they will not comply with the integration mandate of the 54 decision, and then 55 with all deliberate speedy, but that wasn't very deliberate at all. And in 1959, there are other counties as well. We've got Norfolk, we've got Charlottesville, we've got Warren County, right? But Prince Edward in 1959 just made the decision, we're still not going to open our schools. And they didn't. And my mother was one of almost 2,000 black students who in 1959 did not have a public school to attend because she was black. Now, speaking of real estate and housing, my grandfather continued to pay real estate taxes. Real estate taxes are what are used to fund public schools and were used to fund public schools then, but his 6 children had no public schools to attend. So what he did was building a house in the Prospect District of Prince Edward County on about 40-some acres of land with 6 children, railroad man, working on railroads, not like he had pockets of money just waiting to build his house. He was still building a house in Prospect, but so that his children could attend schools, he rented a house in adjoining Cumberland County so that they could go to public schools. Now, he had 6 children, though. 3 oldest ended up, my mother being one of them after that year of renting, living in Baltimore with family. I remember my mother attended Catholic school there on the east side. But when we talk, and in one breath, you're thinking, well, that's great. She had a school to go to, but she had 3 siblings that she talked to once a month, using their aunt's phone, because there wasn't a phone in their house, and that's how they communicated. So when we talk about disruption of families, all because of this pervasive and ever-present racism, the smaller issues, so for a year, my mother was away from her mother and her father, and also her younger sisters. What is the toll that this even takes? Aside from educational loss, I think we could go on and on and on, but when schools reopened, she did end up coming back. This was after the preschool, and she graduated as, I think, the last class of Robert Russell Milton High before they changed the name to Prince Edward County High to be more inviting to white families. Now that's the conversation.
Well, we want to, we're running out of time for questions.
Where can I see her portrait?
Oh, there, I'll ask that question. So Barbara has a portrait. The last time I saw it was in the governor's mansion.
It's still there.
Okay, yeah, so there's a portrait of her in the governor's mansion, and then there's also the Attorney General's office was renamed for her, and there's a picture of her there as well.
The statue's still being commissioned, right?
And the General Assembly did pass a bill that her statue, which is in the process of being commissioned, will replace General Reed in the statutory hall. And if you have a chance, please, next time you're at the Capitol, the Civil Rights Memorial is all about the story of Prince Edward County. So there is a statue that includes her, Spotswood Robinson, Oliver Hill, and Reverend Francis Griffin, who provided a lot of moral support for the students in particular. And I think was really instrumental in helping the community rally around the students. But enough from us. We want to hear from Barbara's family. So I want to invite her sister Joan, who was a sophomore, a freshman. So imagine you're a freshman in high school. You're a freshman in high school. You're called down to an assembly. You're sitting there, and you see your older sister standing on the stage. What were you thinking? And tell us what unfolded.
You don't have to come.
Okay, if you'll come sit at the table, because we want to make sure the folks watching on Facebook Live here.
Do you want to bring your brothers up too, just so they
Yes.
can see?
Robert, Ernest, if you all want to come.
We insist.
So you won't be alone.
hot and the other students were too cold. In the winter months, we often sat in class wearing our coats and boots to keep warm. When it rained, we helped our teachers place pails around the room to catch the water. We had hand-me-down books from the white high school that were tattered and torn. We had no science labs, no gym, no lockers, no cafeteria, and no school supplies. Our teachers had to buy many items that we needed for school. We had excellent teachers who pushed us to excel and demanded our undivided attention. Barbara decided to go to her favorite teacher, Miss Inez Davenport, who taught both of us music, and discussed the conditions of the school with her. She listened to Barbara, then said to her, "Well, why don't you do something about it?" Her question surprised Barbara, and she said it did not occur to her to ask her what she meant. She felt she had dismissed her with that reply. So Barbara devised a plan that she felt was divinely inspired and summoned her fellow classmates that she trusted, and they coordinated the details of the strike. The morning of April 23rd, 1951 was a normal school day. But when we were summoned to the auditorium, everything changed. Instead of our principal, M. Boyd Jones, on the stage, there stood my sister Barbara at the lectern. I was so shocked that I slid down in my seat as low as I could. She explained to us that the conditions at our school were intolerable and that we needed to go on a strike for a better school. She asked us to please cooperate with her and tell our parents to support her. She made it very clear to us that this was the only way that we would get any results. When one of the students asked if we were going to get in trouble for this, she replied that Bonneville jail was not big enough to hold all of them, so we should not worry. Needless to say, we followed her out of school for 2 weeks. The students had devised a scheme to get our principal out of the school prior to the assembly in the auditorium. One of the students, John Watson, put a handkerchief over his mouth and called the principal's office to tell him that some of his students were downtown when they should have been in school. As soon as the principal left, Barbara sent a note to the teachers to come to the auditorium. She had forged the principal's initials on the note. When they came, she politely asked them to leave. And when one of the male teachers resisted, 2 of the male students led him out of the auditorium. My first reaction to what had occurred was fear. I thought that the white community would try to harm us, and I worried that our parents would discipline us too, even though Barbara had told us we should not be afraid. I had no idea what the consequences of our actions would be. All that Barbara wanted was to have a better educational facility for us and to be treated as an equal to the students in the white community. Barbara told our parents what had happened that day. They were very shocked, but their immediate concern was for her safety. After receiving threats, they decided they needed to send her to finish her senior year of high school to Montgomery, Alabama, to live with our uncle Vernon Johns, pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and a civil rights activist in his own right. Barbara graduated from the Alabama State Collegiate Preparatory School there. After the strike, Barbara realized that we were going to need some support, so she contacted Reverend L. Francis with the NAACP to get attorneys to represent the students. He also provided the church as a meeting place so that the community could seek and get information on what had happened, what their options were, and how to best handle the situation. Barbara and Carrie Stokes wrote a letter to prominent civil rights attorneys on the Hill and Spotswood Robinson in Richmond, Virginia, to ask for their help. At first they refused because of their tight schedules. But Barbara didn't call Oliver Hill, and he said she was so persistent that they decided to stop the formula en route to another place. When they saw how serious the students were, they told them if they could persuade their parents to sign them as plaintiffs in a suit that would become part of Brown versus Board of Education, then they would help them. 119 parents signed for their children to become plaintiffs in Davis versus Prince Edward County. Barbara wrote a diary about what happened during the strike in 1951 that was found by her husband after she died September 25th, 1991. I thought it was very interesting, and I would like to share some of her excerpts in quotes as follows. Quote, "We were fond of our teachers. My favorite and the one who had the greatest impact on my young life was Miss Davenport, my music teacher, who later became Mrs. Jones, the wife of the principal of the school. Besides introducing us to the beauty of classical music, she permitted full expressions in her classes, something quite foreign to most of the class. Most teachers taught and we listened and responded to their comments when requested. But Ms. Davenport felt that everything in life lent itself to a variety of opinions, thoughts, moods, moments, much the same as music. And she encouraged you to respond that way. I got to know her more intimately when she became the music teacher for my sister and I when we took music lessons after school. I felt I could share my innermost thoughts with her and she wouldn't consider them ridiculous. This is how I happened to mention to her how unhappy I was with the school building and its inadequacies. I told her it wasn't fair that we had such a poor facility, equipment, etc. when our white counterparts enjoyed science labs, a huge facility, gym, etc. I warmed to my subject and looked to her for some answer to my frustration. She paused for a few minutes and then asked me, "Why don't you do something about it?" I was surprised at the question, but it did not occur to me to ask her what she meant. I just slowly turned away as I felt she had dismissed me with no reply. What could one do about such a situation? I had no idea. But I spent many days in my favorite hangout in the woods, on my favorite stump, contemplating it all. I sat by the creek while Sadie Red drank. Sadie Red was our horse. And I thought about it. My imagination would run rampant, and I would dream that some mighty man of great wealth through God would build us a new school. Or that our parents got together and surprised us with this brand new building, and we had a big celebration. I even imagined that a great storm came through and blew down the main building and splattered the shacks to splinters. And out of this wreckage rose this magnificent building. And all the students were joyous, and even the teachers cried. But then reality would set in, and I would be forced to acknowledge that nothing magical was going to produce a new school. And then there were times I just prayed, God, please grant us a new school. Please let us have a warm place to stay where we won't have to keep our coats on all day to stay warm. their buses weren't overcrowded. Their teacher bus driver didn't have to make the fire before we could start classes. One morning, I was so busy rushing my brothers and sisters down the hill to school that I forgot my own lunch and had to rush back up the hill to retrieve it. In the meantime, the bus arrived, picked them up, and left me standing there by the roadside, waiting to come a ride with whoever came by. About an hour later, I was still waiting when the white bus drives by, evidently on its way to Cornwall High School. It would have had to pass my school to get to that school, but I couldn't ride with it. Right then and there, I decided that indeed something had to be done about this inequality. But I still didn't know what. All day, my mind and thoughts were whirling. And as I lay in my bed that night, I prayed for help. Whether in a dream or whether I was awake, but I felt I was awake. A plan began to formulate in my mind. A plan I felt was divinely inspired, because I hadn't been able to think of anything until then. That plan was to assemble together the student council members who I considered the creme de la creme of the school. However, they were smart and were thinkers. I knew them and trusted them, and I was a part of them. From this, we would formulate a plan to go out on strike. We would make signs, and I would give a speech stating our dissatisfaction. And we would march out of the school. People would hear us, see us, and understand our difficulty, would sympathize with our plight, and would grant us our new school building. Our teachers would be proud, and the students would learn more. It would be grand, and we would live happily ever after. Fully confident that all of this would transpire, I rose early the next morning, rushed to get everyone out, and I could hardly wait to get to school to call this meeting. I was self-sufficient and independent, because my mother was not around to rely on or to consult. My father was too busy plowing and planning and harvesting to have time for any fantasy of mine, and he would have considered it foolish and never agreed with it, or he would not have stopped me. I was permitted free rein in my thinking and actions. As he put it, I was too stubborn and too determined to have my own way. So why hassle myself? I didn't consult my Uncle Vernon because he wasn't around. And really, I didn't feel the need to consult anyone anyway. It had been given to me. All I had to do was do it. That was Barbara's own words, and I just wanted to share them with you.
Thank you. Very good.
Well, unless anyone has anything else they'd like to share, I think, you would like to share any thoughts?
Well, I'll share one comment. My mom was pregnant when all this occurred. I was born 3 months after. And I never knew anything about this walkout or anything that occurred in Prince Edward County until I was a sophomore in college. My professor told me that there was a book in the library that had my family's name because they closed their school. And I had no idea, my family never talked about it, so I was not aware of any of this. So I've been learning over these last few years what transpired. And for my sister, she never said anything about it. And my brother probably knows a lot more than I do. So, yeah. I want to share.
Well, thank you for sharing those words. stories.